Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. A sleeping couple is laying in bed. Crystal stirred first, her eyes fluttering open as she reached for her phone to silence the alarm. She glanced over at Dan, still fast asleep, and sighed. Another day of being the sole breadwinner loomed ahead. Slipping out of bed, Crystal padded to the bathroom to begin her morning routine. As she brushed her teeth, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. It had been 3 months since Dan lost his job, and the strain was beginning to show in their relationship. After showering and dressing in her crisp white uniform, Crystal made her way to the kitchen. She started the coffee maker and began preparing a simple breakfast of toast and eggs. The aroma of coffee filled the air, and soon she heard the sound of Dan's footsteps approaching. "Morning," he mumbled, scratching his unshaven face as he shuffled into the kitchen. "Good morning," Crystal replied, her tone neutral. She placed a plate of food in front of him and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Any plans for today?" Dan shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Might look at some job listings online." Crystal nodded, trying to keep the skepticism from her voice. "That sounds good. I'll be home around 6. There are leftovers in the fridge for lunch." She gathered her things and headed for the door, pausing briefly to look back at Dan. He sat hunched over his plate, looking dejected and lost. A part of her wanted to comfort him, but another part was growing increasingly frustrated with his lack of initiative. As she drove to work, Crystal's mind wandered to the upcoming weekend. There was a big flea market she'd been looking forward to, and she hoped Dan wouldn't give her a hard time about going. It was one of the few things that brought her joy these days. The dental office was already bustling when Crystal arrived. She greeted her coworkers with a smile, pushing her personal worries aside as she prepared for her first patient of the day. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," Crystal said warmly as she led the elderly woman to the examination chair. "How have you been?" As she worked, Crystal found herself envying Mrs. Johnson's stories about her grandchildren and her recent trip to Florida. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she and Dan had taken a vacation or done anything fun together. The day passed quickly, filled with the familiar routine of cleanings, x-rays, and patient education. Before she knew it, it was time to head home. Crystal's stomach tightened with anxiety as she approached their apartment building. She never knew what mood she'd find Dan in these days. To her surprise, the apartment was tidy when she walked in. Dan was sitting on the couch, laptop balanced on his knees. "Hey," he said, looking up as she entered. "How was work?" "It was fine," Crystal replied, setting down her purse. "The place looks nice. Did you clean?" Dan nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. "Yeah, I figured I should do something useful today. And I applied for a few jobs online." Crystal felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were starting to turn around. "That's great, Dan. Thank you for cleaning up. It really helps." They shared a small smile, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Crystal decided to seize the opportunity to broach the subject of the flea market. "So, I was thinking about checking out that big flea market this weekend," she said casually as she heated up the leftovers. "Would you like to come with me?" Dan's expression darkened slightly. "I don't know, Chris. You know I'm not really into that stuff, and we should be saving money, not spending it on junk." Crystal felt her frustration rising. "It's not junk, Dan, and I'm not planning to spend a lot. It's just something I enjoy doing. I thought it might be nice for us to get out of the house together." Dan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, if you want to go, go. I just don't see the point in wasting time and money on other people's cast-offs." The tension in the room was palpable. Crystal bit her lip, trying to keep her temper in check. "Fine. I'll go by myself then. It's not like you have anything better to do anyway." As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Dan's face fell and he stood up abruptly. "I'm not hungry. I'm going to bed." Crystal watched him go, feeling a mixture of guilt and frustration. She ate her dinner alone, the TV providing background noise to drown out the silence from the bedroom. The next morning, Crystal left for work without seeing Dan. She'd heard him moving around in the bathroom as she was getting ready, but he hadn't emerged before she had to leave. The distance between them felt wider than ever. At work, Crystal threw herself into her tasks with renewed vigor, grateful for the distraction. During her lunch break, she found herself browsing online listings for part-time jobs. Maybe if she picked up some extra hours, they could ease some of the financial pressure. But the thought of working even more while Dan sat at home made her feel resentful all over again. When she arrived home that evening, the apartment was quiet. A note on the kitchen counter caught her eye. "Went for a walk. Be back later. Dan." Crystal sighed, both relieved and disappointed to have the place to herself. She changed into comfortable clothes and settled on the couch with a book, trying to lose herself in the story. But her mind kept wandering to Dan, wondering where he was and what he was thinking. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she heard the key in the lock. Dan walked in, looking tired, but less dejected than he had in recent days.
"Hey," he said softly. "Sorry I'm late. I ended up walking further than I planned."
Crystal nodded, setting her book aside. "It's okay. Did you eat?"
"Yeah, I grabbed a sandwich earlier."
Dan hesitated, then sat down on the other end of the couch.
"Listen, Chris, I've been thinking. I know I haven't been the easiest person to live with lately. I'm sorry for being such a downer about the flea market thing. If you still want to go this weekend, I'll come with you." Crystal felt a wave of emotion wash over her.
It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something.
"Really?
You don't have to if you don't want to." Dan managed a small smile.
"I want to. I think getting out of the house might do me some good. And I miss spending time with you."
Crystal reached out and squeezed his hand. "I miss that too. Thank you, Dan. It means a lot." They spent the rest of the evening watching a movie together, the tension between them easing slightly. As they got ready for bed, Crystal felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to look up. Saturday morning arrived with a burst of sunshine streaming through the windows. Crystal woke up early, excited for the day ahead. To her surprise, Dan was already up and dressed when she entered the kitchen.
"Morning,"
he said, handing her a cup of coffee.
"I thought we could grab breakfast on the way to the flea market. That little diner you like is on the route, right?"
Crystal couldn't hide her smile.
"That sounds perfect.
Thank you, Dan." They set off shortly after, the car ride filled with comfortable small talk. It felt like ages since they'd done something as simple as going out for breakfast together. At the diner, they shared a plate of pancakes and reminisced about their early dating days when they used to come here every weekend. The flea market was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Crystal's eyes lit up as she took in the rows of stalls filled with an eclectic mix of items. Dan watched her with a mixture of amusement and affection.
"Okay, where do we start?"
he asked, gesturing to the sprawling market. Crystal grinned. "Let's just wander and see what catches our eye. That's the best part." They made their way through the stalls, Crystal occasionally stopping to examine an interesting piece of jewelry or a vintage book. To her delight, Dan seemed to be getting into the spirit of things, pointing out quirky items and even haggling with a vendor over an old record player. "Look at this," Crystal said, holding up a beautiful emerald green dress. The fabric shimmered in the sunlight, its vintage style reminiscent of 1950s glamour. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Dan nodded, admiring the dress.
"It's very you. Why don't you try it on?"
Crystal hesitated.
"I don't know. We're trying to save money, remember?" "Come on, Chris. You work hard. You deserve to treat yourself once in a while," Dan encouraged. "Besides, I've got some cash left from selling those old golf clubs last week."
Touched by his gesture, Crystal decided to try on the dress. The vendor directed her to a makeshift changing area, and a few minutes later she emerged, twirling for Dan. "What do you think?" she asked, smoothing down the fabric. Dan's face fell slightly.
"It looks great on you, but I think it might be a little big. See how it's loose around the waist?" Crystal turned to look in a nearby mirror and saw that Dan was right. The dress was indeed a bit too large, hanging awkwardly in certain areas. She sighed, disappointed. "You're right. It's a shame, though. The color is perfect." As they walked away from the stall, Dan suddenly chuckled. "You know, if it's too big for you, maybe I should wear it. After all, I'm the one sitting at home all day now. Might as well embrace my new role as a housewife." He'd meant it as a joke, a self-deprecating comment to lighten the mood. But something in Crystal's expression made him pause. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. Crystal bit her lip, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Well, why not? I mean, you're not wrong about being home all day. And it would be a shame to let such a beautiful dress go to waste." Dan stared at her, trying to gauge if she was serious. "Chris, come on. I was kidding." "Were you?" she challenged playfully. "Because I think you might look rather fetching in green. And who knows, it might be fun to shake things up a bit." Dan felt a strange flutter in his stomach. Part of him wanted to laugh off the suggestion, but another part, a part he'd never acknowledged before, was intrigued. "You can't be serious." Crystal shrugged, a smile playing at her lips. "Why not? It's just us. No one else has to know. And like you said, you're home all day anyway. Might as well have some fun with it." The idea hung between them, electric and slightly dangerous. Dan found himself nodding slowly. "Okay, let's do it." Crystal's eyes widened in surprise and excitement. "Really? You're sure?" "Yeah," Dan said, his voice a mix of nervousness and anticipation. "Why not? Like you said, it might be fun to shake things up." They returned to the stall, and Crystal purchased the dress, her heart racing with the thrill of their secret plan. As they continued through the market, both of them were hyper-aware of the bag containing the green dress, their shared secret adding a new layer of excitement to the day. On the drive home, they chatted about their finds at the market, but there was an undercurrent of tension, not uncomfortable, but charged with anticipation. As soon as they entered the apartment, Crystal turned to Dan with a grin. "So, ready to try on your new outfit?" Dan felt a mix of nerves and exhilaration. "I can't believe we're actually doing this." Crystal handed him the bag. "Go on, try it on. I'll wait out here." With shaking hands, Dan took the bag and went into the bedroom. He stared at himself in the mirror for a long moment before slowly beginning to undress. As he slipped the dress over his head, he was struck by how soft the fabric felt against his skin. Adjusting the dress, Dan was surprised to find that it fit him rather well. The waist cinched in just the right place, and the skirt fell gracefully to his knees. He ran his hands over the material, marveling at how it felt. "Dan," Crystal called from the living room. "Everything okay in there?" Taking a deep breath, Dan opened the door and stepped out. Crystal's eyes widened as she took him in. "Oh my," she breathed. "Dan, you look amazing." Dan felt his cheeks flush. "Really? I feel kind of silly." Crystal shook her head, approaching him slowly. "Not silly at all. The color suits you perfectly, and look how it fits. It's like it was made for you." Dan turned to look at his reflection in the hallway mirror. He was startled by how different he looked. Softer, somehow. "I can't believe how comfortable it is," he admitted, smoothing down the skirt. Crystal smiled, a glint in her eye. "You know, if you're going to do this, we might as well do it properly. How about I do your makeup?" Dan's eyes widened. "Makeup? I don't know, Chris. Isn't that taking it a bit far?" "Come on, it'll be fun," Crystal coaxed. "Just a little bit. If you don't like it, you can wash it right off." After a moment's hesitation, Dan nodded. "Okay, but nothing too crazy, all right?" Crystal clapped her hands excitedly. "Deal! Come on, let's go to the bathroom. The lighting's better in there." As they walked to the bathroom, Dan couldn't help but notice how the dress swished around his legs. It was a foreign sensation, but not an unpleasant one. In the bathroom, Crystal rummaged through her makeup bag, pulling out various items. "Okay, let's start with some foundation to even out your skin tone."
she began applying the makeup with gentle, practiced strokes. Dan closed his eyes, surprised by how relaxing it felt to have someone else pampering him like this. "Now for some eyeshadow," Crystal murmured, her face close to Dan's as she worked. "I think a soft green to match the dress would look lovely." As she continued applying the makeup, Dan found himself becoming more and more curious about the transformation taking place. When Crystal finally announced that she was finished and told him to open his eyes, he was almost nervous to look. "Oh my God," Dan whispered as he stared at his reflection. The person looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. His eyes looked bigger, more expressive, framed by long lashes and a hint of shimmering green eyeshadow. His cheekbones seemed more pronounced, and his lips were a soft, rosy pink. "What do you think?" Crystal asked, watching his reaction carefully. Dan touched his face gently, afraid to smudge the makeup. I don't know what to say. It's so different." "Different good or different bad?" Crystal pressed. After a moment's consideration, Dan smiled softly. "Different good, I think. I never imagined I could look like this." Crystal beamed at him. "You look beautiful, Dan, truly." The word beautiful sent a thrill through Dan. He'd never been called beautiful before. Handsome, sure, but beautiful? That was new. "So what now?" Dan asked, still staring at his reflection. Crystal shrugged. "Whatever you want. We could watch a movie or... Oh, I have an idea. Wait here." She dashed out of the bathroom, returning a moment later with her phone. "Let's take some pictures. You look too good not to document this." Dan hesitated. "I don't know, Chris. What if someone sees them?" "We don't have to show anyone," Crystal assured him. "They'll just be for us. Come on, it'll be fun." Reluctantly, Dan agreed. They moved to the living room, where Crystal directed him to pose on the couch, by the window, even twirling in the middle of the room. As they looked through the photos together, Dan was amazed at how different he looked and how natural he seemed in the dress. "These are actually really good," he admitted, swiping through the pictures on Crystal's phone. Crystal nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Dan, you seem really comfortable like this. How do you feel?" Dan paused, considering the question. "I feel good. Really good, actually. It's strange, but I like it. Is that weird?" "Not at all," Crystal said softly. "If it makes you happy, that's what matters." They spent the rest of the evening with Dan, still in the dress and makeup. They ordered takeout and watched a movie, and Dan was surprised at how quickly he forgot about his unusual attire. It just felt right. As they got ready for bed that night, Dan found himself reluctant to take off the dress and remove the makeup. Crystal noticed his hesitation. "You can keep it on if you want," she said gently. "We can wash the sheets tomorrow if any makeup rubs off." Dan smiled gratefully. "Thanks, Chris, for everything. Today was unexpected, but really nice." Crystal leaned in and hugged him softly. "I'm glad. Sleep well, beautiful." As Dan drifted off to sleep, still wearing the green dress, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. He didn't know what it meant yet, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of excitement about the future. The next morning, Dan woke up before Crystal. He lay in bed for a few moments, feeling the soft fabric of the dress against his skin. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and he felt a mixture of embarrassment and exhilaration. Quietly, so as not to wake Crystal, he slipped out of bed and padded to the bathroom. His reflection in the mirror startled him. The makeup was smudged, giving him a somewhat raccoon-like appearance. But underneath it all, he could still see traces of the transformation from yesterday. Dan wet a washcloth and began to gently remove the makeup. As his familiar face emerged, he felt a strange sense of loss. He liked how he looked with the makeup, he realized. It wasn't just about the physical appearance, it was how it made him feel. Softer, prettier, more himself. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. What did it mean? Was this just a fun experiment? Or was it something more? Lost in thought, Dan didn't hear Crystal approach until she spoke from the doorway. "Morning, sleepyhead. How are you feeling?" Dan turned to face her, washcloth still in hand. "I'm not sure. It's all a bit confusing, to be honest." Crystal stepped into the bathroom and placed a comforting hand on his arm.
"That's understandable. Yesterday was quite an experience. Do you want to talk about it?"
Dan nodded slowly.
"Yeah, I think I do. But can we have coffee first? I feel like I need to be more awake for this conversation."
Thanks for watching. Check out Patreon if you want to have early access to the other parts. If not, it will be online in a couple of days.